The Reasonable Person Standard for Business Law and Ethics 2, March 29th, 2015. The Reasonable Person Standard can be and has been applied in many types of cases, including civil, criminal cases, child cases, and in cases that involve children in adult activities. But the purpose of this presentation is an overview of the subject, not an in-depth look at the subject. Nolo's Plain English Law Dictionary defines the reasonable person standard as a legal standard used in negligence cases. The hypothetical reasonable person behaves in a way that is legally appropriate. Those who do not meet this standard, that is, they do not behave at least as a reasonable person would, are considered negligent and may be held liable for damages caused by their actions. Therefore, this standard deals with the behavior of the person, not the mental state they were in at the time of the incident. Definitions are nice, but who is this reasonable person? This person is really just a fictitious person invented by the legal professional as the ideal average person and how they would act under a given set of circumstances. Courts reach for the reasonable person when the relevant standard requires some attentiveness to the individual qualities of the litigant as well as to the objective content of the legal norm. The notion of a reasonable person residing in each human being can be found in the works of St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. They believed in the existence of natural virtues which incline men to act in accordance with right reason. The whole idea here is to use the standard to measure a person's actions in a particular situation. The reasonable person standard is an objective standard. It is meant to be a broad representation of the community and not any single person. This question often arises in tort or liability cases where a claim of negligence is being made against another person. The reasonable person considers how likely a certain harm is to occur, how serious the harm would be if it did occur, and the burden involved in avoiding the harm. If the person in question has knowledge superior to most people, then the law requires that the person conduct themselves according to their actual skill or knowledge. Therefore, a judge would be held to a higher standard than would a paralegal. The general rule for tradesmen and professionals is that they are required to exercise the degree of care exercised by members of their trade or profession. As this is a civil wrong, it is up to the courts to decide if the person accused actually did fail to meet the reasonable person standard. The standard allows the courts the ability to weigh all of the facts of the case in coming to its decision. For example, what if the reasonable person standard was viewed from the standpoint of negligence? If a person was to be held negligent in their actions, that person would have to have acted in a way that showed that they did not exercise care towards another person in a way that a reasonable person would have if given the same set of circumstances. If the reasonable person would not foresee a harmful consequence of the action, then a defendant will not be held negligent in failing to take precautions. But if the damages were apparent to the person and they completed the action anyway, there would be a basis for a tort claim. So, just what is a tort? A tort is an injury to one person for which the person who caused the injury is legally responsible. In this case, the reasonable person standard would be applied against the actions of the one who caused the injury to see if their actions were reasonable for the circumstances they occurred in. If the actions were not reasonable, then a liability would exist for the one who injured the other party. Liabilities are when someone is legally held accountable for their actions or lack thereof. This also carries over into a business where it owes monies such as wages to a worker or payment for goods and services rendered to it by a vendor. For a person to be held liable in a tort claim, a couple of things have to happen. 3 of these things are key to proving negligence. First, there must be a duty owed. Secondly, the actions taken or not taken would not have been what a reasonable person would have done. And thirdly, that the damages caused were a direct result of those actions or inactions. There is an additional aspect to this in that the damages caused by the action or inaction of the person in question could have been foreseen at the time of the incident. First, was there a duty owed? A duty is a legal relationship created by law or contract in which a person or business owes something to another. For example, if you drive a car, you have a duty to obey the rules of the road. This duty to obey the rules of the road is known as the duty of care. The duty of care is a requirement that a person act towards others and the public with the watchfulness, attention, caution that a reasonable person in the circumstances would use. It is interesting to note that the phrase reasonable person shows up in this legal definition. The second part of this is determining whether the actions taken or not taken would not have been what a reasonable person would have done. For example, would a reasonable person drive down the street in the middle of the night at high speed without their lights on? The answer is no. A reasonable person would not do this. Thus, part of the duty of care when driving is to ensure that not only you can see where you are going, but that others can see you as well. Therefore, if you did not act as a reasonable person would have, you would have violated the duty to care requirement. Should you have crashed into another vehicle while driving at night, at high speed, without your lights on, then the damages caused in that accident were a direct result of those actions. This would satisfy the third requirement in proving causation of the accident by your actions, and that the damages incurred were a direct result of those actions. Thus, you would be held liable in this case. As the driver of the vehicle, it should have been apparent that it was nighttime. The speed of the vehicle was excessive. The Motor Vehicle Code requires the use of headlights after dark, and the chances of being in an accident were high. The reasonable person is expected to conform to statutory law and judicial decisions and cannot claim ignorance of the law even if the standard of conduct required by the law contradicts the custom of the community, because ignorance of the law is no excuse under the reasonable person standard. The aforementioned is an exaggerated and oversimplified example meant to clarify how the reasonable person standard could be applied. In reality, the application can be much more complicated depending upon which area of law the standard is being applied to. There have been numerous books, articles, and theses presented that have debated the practicality and application of this standard in modern law. These debates have brought into light certain other aspects of this reasonable person, such as age, gender, and mental capacity. As stated in People v. Jefferson, the common law does not take account of a person's mental capacity when determining whether he has acted as the reasonable person would have acted. The law holds the mentally deranged or insane defendant accountable for his negligence as if the person were a normal, prudent person. The reasonable person standard is not that simple and not that cut and dry as presented here. What is reasonable to one person in one time period, in one culture, of a certain age, gender, political viewpoint, and geographical location would not be to another person when viewed from their perspective. The Egyptians thought it was reasonable to expend huge resources for the successful journey of the pharaoh to the afterlife. They built massive structures requiring enormous amounts of labor and material. What would happen today if this idea was put forth and tried to be duplicated for a U.S. president? The chances of that happening in today's society are probably nil, and the ensuing backlash would be severe. In summary, the reasonable person does not exist in reality. They are a figment of our imagination, conjured up as a measure of one's actions for legal purposes. As a legal fiction, the reasonable person is not an average person or a typical person, which begs the question, is the average or typical person reasonable?